Okay, go.
Okay, so in the last two classes we discussed the, oh, Ilana, can you pin me? I don't know. Oh, I'll pin myself. Never mind. Okay. Hi. So in the last two classes, we discussed the self and the self both as a central theme and preoccupation in the Tehillim, and also, hi Anne, and also as a new ground for, or I should say, a ground or a bedrock for a new theological approach to spirituality in Judaism. And these were things that we saw by really reading the Psalms as poetic religious texts, which they are. But the thing is that they're not only that. The Psalms were never meant to be a written text that people read and learn and move on. They're always supposed to be used. Many of them were supposed to be sung. There's all these words that repeat themselves in Tehillim, like Selah, that don't mean anything. And the common interpretation is that it was a musical cue, that when the Levites sang it in the temple, they knew what it means. That meant some particular way of raising your voice or twirling your voice or something. We don't know. We just don't know. We lost that music. And there's other words like that. There's aspects of the rhythm of the Tehillim that make it clear that it's supposed to be spoken up. Some of the Psalms are written in ways that it looks like it's supposed to be not simply spoken or sang, but also spoken or sang by several people that are asking or answering, like a chorus, asking, answering, and having almost a duet, a conversation. And of course, beyond the role that the Psalms were supposed to fulfill and fulfilled in the temple and the service, they also fulfilled many, many roles for people since then. They're parts of our liturgy that we either read quietly or sing together. There's something people turn to in times of anguish or in times of joy. There's something that the Kabbalah teachers explored as a source of sgulot, of like signs or like ways to, like a almost magical, a way to evoke some sort of protection or some sort of I don't even know how to explain. I'm not a Kabbalah scholar by any stretch of the imagination, but to evoke some sort of emotional, spiritual protection for ourselves. They read them by looking for hints and clues for mysteries in the writing and then use them like that, etc., etc., etc. And when we approach the Psalms and try and understand them, if we ignore all of that, all of these millennia of usage, all of this millennia of usage, all of this many different forms that the Psalms took in people's life and in shaping them, then we're missing out on a lot of the meaning, because we're only seeing a very, very, very small, narrow, limited part of it, and we're treating it as if it's the face all of what's there. So what I want to do now is we're going to look very closely at two particular Psalms, both of which there's a minhag to read on Chanukah, and I'll get to that in a bit. And what we're going to do with each of them in turn is we're going to start by examining it narrowly as a text. What does a text show us? And then we're going to start zooming out gradually and adding more and more layers of the history of how it was used, the different practices of its usage, the different interpretations that people adopted in different times of history when they used it. And we're going to see how every step backwards, how every expansion of our point of view adds new layers and new meaning to these Psalms. And then we're going to ask why, we're going to come back and kind of summarize it all by asking, what does it give us to read these two particular Psalms with their long histories, with their these long seas of meaning attached to them on Chanukah in particular. So let's start. We're going to start with a very, very famous one. Psalm 30, which we read, well, we'll talk about usage in a minute. It's a very famous poem of deliverance, a very well-known, used one. And before we start talking about it, as I said, in more detail, we're going to really read it as a text and try and see what's in this text and what is it telling us. And we're going to do it together. I'm going to read the whole thing, and then I'm going to start asking questions, and we're going to try and poke it together and see what we get. A psalm of David, a song for the dedication of the house. I extol you, O Lord, for you have lifted me up and not let my enemies rejoice over me. O Lord, my God, I cried out to you and you healed me. O Lord, you brought me up from the Sheol, preserved me from going down into the pit. O you faithful of the Lord, sing to him and praise his holy name, for he is angry but a moment, and when he is pleased, there is life. One may lie down weeping at nightfall, but at dawn there are shouts of joy. When I was untroubled, in Hebrew it's ve'ani amarti besholvi, at my time of peace, my time of relaxation almost, I thought, I shall never be shaken. For you, O Lord, for you, O Lord, when you are pleased, made me firm as a mighty mountain. When you hid your face, I was terrified. I called to you, O Lord, to my Lord I made appeal. What is to be gained from my death, from my descent into the pit? Can dust praise you? Can it declare your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and have mercy on me. O Lord, be my help. Just a minute. You turned my lament into dancing. You undid my sackcloth and girded me with joy, that my whole being might sing hymns to you endlessly. O Lord my God, I will praise you forever. Or in Hebrew, I'll read the last pasuk in Hebrew. Leman yezamrecha kavod velo idom, Adonai Elokai, leolam odecha. A beautiful, beautiful poem, and we're going to start analyzing it as such. So for the purposes of this most narrow of analysis, we're going to ignore the first verse, what's often called the title verse, that kind of gives it context, gives it a little bit of a sense of where it's coming from or what its usage. We will get to that in the next step in our analysis. We're going to start from the place where the kind of bulk, where the flesh of the poem starts, which is, I extol you, O Lord, for you have lifted me up and not let my enemies rejoice me. So now I would like to ask you, and here I'm just going to make it a little smaller so we can all see the whole poem at once. Can you see what I'm seeing? Can you see the whole poem now? Okay. Yeah. And when I mark something, can you see it? Like yes. This? Okay, great. I'm never sure exactly what's going on your end. So just from this reading, what do you think this is about? What is the theme of the poem?
I think it's about, it's Rebecca here. I mean, there are two thoughts that run through my head. One is you have this person who is experiencing great darkness or in a low point or feeling beset possibly, and then thanking Hashem for bringing light and for saving. The only thing when I saw the idea of Bor, I mean, I usually did think of Yosef or Daniel or something like that, but still this idea of being in darkness and then salvation, right? Like,
yeah, so I think you're identifying the two key components in a sense. So there's several parts here that are about the feeling inside the pit, the feeling, for example, here, this whole section that starts in verse 8 is where he's describing his feeling of despair when he's inside that pit, where he's in that place of darkness, as Rebecca put it. And there's other parts, for example, verses 2 and 3, and that express his joy, or also at the end, the ending of the poem again expresses his joy and sense of deliverance. What does anybody else want to add anything? For example, what is this section, the section that starts with verse 5? How does that fit into this? Would anyone like to add something? Speak up, because I can't see all of you at once, so I can't tell if you're trying to say something.
Well, there's sort of the idea of just singing praises to God as a major positive activity. I'm doing it. Everybody else should do it. God, don't kill me because otherwise I can't do it. That seems to be not just as a, reaction, oh, great, I'm thanking God because he saved me, but also just this particular, just as almost as an end in itself.
It seems to me, thank you for including me, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, by the way. Nice to meet you all. It seems to me that that actually is the central theme of the psalm.
How so?
It seems to me that, I don't know how so, but it seems to me that that is what the psalm is about, particularly the last line. One may lie down weeping at nightfall, but at dawn there are shouts of joy. And then the rest of it is an explanation.
That's very interesting. You're saying that I just want to make sure I understand you correctly, Susan.
Yes.
Are you saying that the central aspect, the central theme or axis, so to speak, of this
Yes.
of the song is the act of thanking God? Do I understand you correctly?
That God is only angry a moment,
Mm-hmm.
and that he is the giver of life, and that one should not despair, because you can be in despair, but then you will find joy. And then he explains it, how that happens and how God delivers that.
So in a sense, if I to build upon what you're saying, Susan, which I think is a powerful insight here, is that it's when he starts by talking to God, right? And this part, the part that starts with verse 2,
That's
he's
a
talking
preface.
to
That's
God.
a preface.
Yeah, but then he turns to other people, and in a sense, what you're saying is that the whole poem is built around this message that he's trying to deliver, and the rest of it is an illustration almost.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting reading. So let's try and schematize it a little bit so that we can keep track of the different ways of looking at this text. So one way is as a song of deliverance. That's a more simple. The simple way. It's not necessarily focused on the message to other people. It's more him sharing his despair, sharing the fact that then God saved him from whatever it was that caused this despair. And in that reading, I would say that this part that we're talking about now, the part from verses 5 and 6, it's almost more that he's inviting other people to share in his joy. And we saw that a little bit in our discussion last month, that there's this idea throughout Tehillim that God wants people to sing to him, that God wants people to turn to him and see his involvement in their life. And therefore, perhaps when a man feels that or a woman feel that have been saved by God, it's appropriate for them to almost reward God or return the favor by singing out loud and sharing the joy. So that's interpretation number one. There's trouble, there's deliverance, and there's joy that's expressed also in sharing the story. There's another reading that's very similar, but the emphasis is different, and that's the reading Susan suggested, that the point is more about that. The point is the message to other people, and the rest of it, the story of trouble and deliverance, is an illustration. But the emphasis of the poem, the weight of the poem, lies not in a personal description of a personal experience, but rather in an attempt to convince other people to have faith in times of despair. I think both are readings that the text bears both of them. The text supports, you can arrange it around both of them. There's also a narrower reading that can rise here, which comes when we look at verse number 3. Adonai Elokai shivati elecha v'tirpaeni, or in English, "O Lord my God, I cried out to you and you healed me." So some interpreters, some commentators, as far back as the Middle Ages, say that it's not about salvation in general as much as it is about being healed from a disease. And they read the whole, all the other metaphors, for example, the metaphor of being in a bull, in a pit, as a way to describe the feeling and the experience of being very, very, very ill and very close to literal death. Other people expand it and say, no, it's not. Healing is the metaphor and not the fact. It's everything else that describes a more general sort of experience of trouble that's the central point. And the healing is just one of the metaphors to describe what it's like to be in a place, in a bad place, and then coming out of it to a good place. And the point is not actual physical healing. The point is just the spiritual process of feeling despair and then realizing that deliverance can come just like that, that you go to sleep weeping and you rise up and there's rina, there's shouts of joy. So those are definitely some of the basic ways of understanding that. But then let us zoom out. Let us take a step back and look at the first verse now. Add that into our discussion. The first verse is Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid. Mizmor and Shir both mean poem or song, and the truth is that the commentators are very hesitant in defining what they actually mean. They point out that in Psalms, they're not used interchangeably. Clearly, they mean something slightly different, but we're not sure what they mean. We lost that knowledge with the work of the temple. So we have Mizmor and Shir, Chanukat Habayit, the dedication of the house for David, to David. And now, as we take this step back and include the title and the poem, the question we should ask ourselves is, what bayit are we talking about? And what does it have to do with David? So what do you think? What are your thoughts on the matter? Anyone?
Well, the first thought is always, of course, a temple, Beit HaMikdash, right? When you think of, right, what is being dedicated.
Mm-hmm. But which temple, Rebecca, the first or the second?
My thought would be the first. I guess I go to the first, and yet the experience of being lifted, the experience described in the actual chapter, one thinks, I guess Israel always went through dark times, but one thinks sort of reflect more of an exile and then being sort of being brought back or something, but I'm not sure on that one. I'm not sure. Yeah.
So you're offering two readings, really. You're offering one reading that says this is a poem about the dedication of the first temple, and another is that this is a poem about the dedication of the second temple, because there is this aspect of return, of being saved from despair. So we'll explore both of them, but I'd like to first hear other suggestions or any comments or thoughts.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is a dedication a one-time thing, or is it a repeated?
So
could it be an annual dedication?
No, dedication is a one-time thing, but sometimes you have a rededication. For example, when the Hashmonaim conquered Jerusalem from the Seleucian Greeks in Hanukkah, they rededicated the temple because they purified it and returned it into a state of operation, and that's why it's Hanukkah.
But is it possible this could have been read more than once?
What do you mean by read? You mean?
Or sung or used?
Yeah. We know that it's been sung regularly.
Okay.
But the dedication is a one-time event.
Okay.
It could be it was sung in celebration of it or in memory of it, but a dedication is a one-time thing.
Would it be a stretch to say that it has, after, David has such a struggle before he becomes king, he's hunted down, he has such dark times before he becomes king. Could the house just be his kingship and the house of David? And could you just say that would be the dedication, that as he establishes his kingship?
So actually there is Ibn Ezra here. Let's just make it bigger. The Ibn Ezra actually suggests exactly this reading. That's exactly his interpretation. And he says that the kingship is expressed when David builds his palace in Jerusalem. And he said he's arguing with other ideas here, but just a moment. It seems to me, I'm reading from here. It seems to me that he composed this song at the dedication of his own house, the house of cedars, because the psalm does not mention the house of God. This usage is similar to the blind and the lame shall not come into the house, as I explained there. At that time, David fell sick and then recovered from his sickness. Rabbi Moshe, Rambam, said that David mourned when Natan, okay, just a second, we'll get back to this idea in a second. But if we accept Rabbi Ibn Ezra's personal opinion, that this is exactly what the poem is about. It's not about trouble in general. It's not about being sick necessarily, though Ibn Ezra then brings that idea back by saying that David was literally sick right before he created his household. But it's rather about his personal troubles in the years that led to his kingship, when he was persecuted and chased, etc., etc., etc. So I want to keep track of the number of readings we see already. We saw a reading where it's about healing, about somebody being healed, most specifically. Then we saw some broader reading saying that it's about someone sharing their personal story of despair and then the joy at deliverance, and that somebody can be David singing it upon building his home in Jerusalem, thus showing that he is now king of all of Israel in a unifying and unified capital of the entire kingdom. Or we can say that it's more that the emphasis lies on the didactic value, on the message here, and that it's a poem encouraging people to have faith in moments of despair. But there's other interpretations. So, for example, you raised here, ladies, the possibility that it's the first temple. This is a very common interpretation, that it's the first temple. Let's look at the Mechilta here. And the Mechilta, the question it's trying to address is, why is the inauguration of the temple here is described as Le David? As we know, David was not allowed to create the first temple. So if we're talking about the first temple, what does it have to do with David? The Mechilta has this beautiful answer. I'm going to start here. Did David build it? Did not Solomon build it? Vis-a-vis, and Solomon built the temple. Why then is it written a psalm, a song of the inauguration of the temple of David? But because David devoted his life to building it, it was called by his name. Because David devoted his life to it, it was called by his name. And thus you find that whatever a man devotes his life to is called by his name, which I think is a beautiful idea in general to learn from this, that because we often devalue desire when it doesn't lead to action. It's like, okay, great, you wanted it, but great, we don't get awards and grades for wanting something. We get it for doing something. Even in Judaism, the idea of halakha means that having faith and good intentions is wonderful, but at the end of the day, there's certain practical measures of whether you're following the covenant or not. And it's not enough to just feel it in your heart. And yet, we see here that if somebody really, really wants to do something and really is prevented, it's counted as if, it's counted on them. It's counted as if they completed it. In that regard, if we look with that in mind at the poem, it's a poem, perhaps we can say a new reading. It's not about David's personal troubles. It's about the process of building a temple. It's about the process of feeling far away from God, feeling exposed, feeling the kind of coldness and distance that comes from not being in a close relationship with God. And then through the building, through the creation of God's home amongst us, coming to feel a different and more authentic sense of closeness to God, and therefore rejoicing, and therefore sharing this joy in this poem, etc., etc., etc. But even amongst those commentators who say that it's, it's talking about the first temple, not everybody agrees with the Mechilta's explanation. And the Ibn Ezra bring in the name of the Rambam a different interpretation for why this is a poem that David is named after David. And he says here, Rabbi Moshe said that David mourned when Natan told him that he would not build the house for the Lord. When he told him that Shlomo, his son, would build the house, he was clothed with joy in place of his mourning, because his son was like him, and his enemy could not disparage him. And he said that suffering of the soul is similar to physical suffering, and even worse is a sense that a man's spirit will sustain his illness. And Rabbak picks up on the same idea and elaborates on it. And I wasn't able to find an English source, so I'll just simultaneously translated, that what happened is that when Shlomo built the temple, it proved to everybody that despite David's sin with Shlomo's own mother, Bathsheba, it was forgiven, and that the dynasty that comes from that union will be the one that God blesses. So in a sense, David did not get to build the temple. He could not dedicate the actual temple, but he received the promise that his son will do it. And this promise showed him that God forgave him. It showed him that his sense of despair that came not from sickness, not from being persecuted by Shaul, not from fighting a civil war, but rather from feeling guilt, from feeling that he himself tore himself apart from God. That is what's Asuaj, and that's the drama that we're watching here in this song that starts by talking about the dedication of the temple, because it's the promise of the dedication of the temple that tells him that God forgave him, and suddenly he feels as if it's morning and there's rina, there's shouts of joy. So we saw this as we saw a reading of the poem that shows it as physical healing from sickness. We saw it as general deliverance. We saw it as David's songs for overcoming all his enemies and building his kingship and his home in Jerusalem. We saw it as the dedication of the temple that's named after David because he desired it. We saw it as a dedication of the first temple, but not really about it, but in a sense like more inspired by it. That David is inspired by the knowledge that there will be a dedication of the first temple, into reminiscing and thinking about the process of despair and joy that comes not from illness, not from trouble, but from sin and guilt. All which are very, very different stories, and yet all of them can be read inside this one text. And if we were to focus only on the text and not on all those interpretations that try and understand where it fits historically, we would not get them. We would only get the more narrow healing / salvation in general reading. Once we try and understand where it fits in the bigger picture, we're starting to get all these different additional possible illuminations of the poem. And this is not it. I didn't bring sources for it, but there's a lot of traditions that say that it is about, as I think Rebecca mentioned, as a possibility about the second temple dedication in the days of Shivat Zion. Some say that it's a prophecy about the rededication of the temple by the Maccabites, i.e. Hanukkah itself. Some say that it's about the future dedication of the future temple that we haven't seen yet, and that it's really, in a sense, following what Susan said before, that the point of the poem is to encourage us. We are the audience. We are the people who are supposed to be encouraged by it, to have faith in the darkness of exile and templelessness. I know it's not a word, but I feel it's fitting here. All of which are reading that exists there. And now I think it's time to take another step back and say, okay, so we looked at the poem as such. We zoomed out and looked at the history of its creation and different interpretations and what it means. Now let's take another step back and look at all these different possibilities sitting side by side, all these possible interpretations. What do we make of this fact, of the very fact that there's so many possible histories and so many interpretations? How do we schematize it so that we don't have to either choose this option or this option? How can we understand it all at once? Is that even possible? And many do try it. And I wanna explore with you one possibility, one way to schematize this, all these different interpretations into one, I would call it meta interpretation. And this is something that Rabbi Sherlow does in Hebrew, so I wasn't able to bring him it in his own words, in a beautiful shiur that he gave a few years ago. And he points out that what do all these different things have in common? The dedication of David's house, the dedication of the first temple, the second temple, the Hanukkah dedication, the future dedication of the third temple, God willing. What do all of them have in common? They're all about starting a new path. Even the reading that focuses on it as a story of personal despair and salvation of any sort, there's a feeling of this is a new morning, right? Yesterday at night, we cried and cried and cried, we wept, but now it's a new morning. Now it's a new beginning and we can start on a new path. This sense we're starting on a new path is captured by the word Chanukah, because the word Chanukah in Hebrew, the root of it is Chanach, Chet Nun Kaf, which really means starting something new. So you can say that it's starting a new house, as in the obvious interpretation here, but it's also the same root that we see in the word chinuch, education, for example, where we start educating someone and start them on a new path. It's also the word for chanicha, which is more what we would more like what people did in the past when they had apprentices. Chanich is an apprentice, is someone who's learning through work, through practice, with a master. All those words have the same sense of you're starting a new path. And what Rav Shelo points out is that when we start a new path, no matter what this path is, there's a psychological process that we often go through, which is at the first moment, the moment when we start, there's this feeling of great revelation and great illumination and a burst of energy that comes from starting something new. And when you start something new, you look at it on the macro level, you see how amazing it can be, you see where it can lead you. You don't see all the minutiae and the details and how hard it's going to be to stick it out day in and day out and day in and day out. You see the big picture and you're excited. And many times in that moment, you also feel close to God. And according to Rav Shelo, this is what the poem starts with. It starts with a description of the sense of great illumination, of this sense of like, thank you, God, you have lifted me up. Thank you, God, I prayed for you and you healed me. There was weeping and now there is joy. But then after this wonderful, amazing moment of the beginning of something new, we start walking the path. We start having to deal with all the challenges, with all the minutiae, with a kind of onset of routine, and we lose it. We lose that sense of excitement and illumination that we had in the beginning. That burst of energy that got us into the run is gone. And now we have to keep dragging ourselves through it. And in the absence of that illumination, great darkness descends on us. Because through the process of becoming set in our ways and kind of confident that this is the path, we're walking on the path, and this is what Rav Shelo thinks this line means, when I was untroubled, or in Hebrew, beshalvi, like when you enter the state of routine, when you no longer are in the establishing mode of creating something new, but rather, I know what I'm doing, this is how it's done, this is the right way, I already built my whole life around it, I'm going to keep walking the same walk. At first it feels good. It feels like, oh, I'm in the right groove. I know what I'm doing. But the farther we get from that illumination moment, from that energy burst of the beginning, the more scary it becomes, because suddenly questions rise like, what, that's it? That's all there is? That's my life? That's the path? Will it ever end? Will I ever succeed? Will it ever get to where I want to get? Whether it's, again, if we're talking about starting a personal path or a national path, no matter what it is, it's just the humdrum of it starts being scary, and suddenly we feel like there's no God in it. We feel like that feeling of closeness to something bigger ourselves that inspired us to start it. Is it really there in the daily details? Is it really there in that boring routine that we have to do over and over again? And that's the moment in the poem when we feel that when you hit your face, I was terrified. Because suddenly our endeavors seem to us lacking in God. And that's a moment when we call out and we ask God for help and participation, and God answers by giving us the strength, by giving us the illumination to keep going on. And what we pray for in the beginning is for the power to continue praising Him, which means also to continue seeing Him forever as we go on the long walk. Any questions, thoughts, comments on this reading? Does it add up to you? Do you think it's a good reading of this? Do you think it's overreaching? Does it speak to you? Do you experience your new beginnings? Yes, Naomi.
I was just going to say that one thing that the words remind me of a little bit in Pirkei Avot, there's a saying, it's not up to us to necessarily complete the task, but we're obligated to begin. So maybe with, I don't know which you know, whether one is a commentary on the other, it kind of reminded me of that you can find comfort in, David is trying to find comfort in the fact of, at least he began the task with the Beit HaMikdash, and appreciating that he had that opportunity, even though he was not able to complete it.
I think it's I wish we all had that ability, right?
Yeah.
The ability to recognize. And the
Yeah.
truth is, I think it also matches rather well with Rabbi Sherlow's interpretation that makes it more generally about any beginning of any new path, because part of what beginning a new path requires from us is that courage to say, I don't know where it's going to lead, but I'm going to start this process, right? I don't know where I'm going to be in 10 years, but I'm going to try. I'm going to walk on this path. And maybe in the beginning, we're carried with enthusiasm, but then the question of, but will it ever end? Will I ever get what I want? Then comes to haunt us later when we lose that energy from the beginning. And that's the feeling of God turned away from us. Wait a minute, is this worth anything? And is this going? I know that's not really what you meant, but I think it does.
But no, it all goes together.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a beautiful comment. Thank you, Nomi. Anybody else? So let's take a moment now and just, we don't have time to discuss it at length, but I'm going to share with you some of the times that this poem is used. It's used in Psukei de Zimra in the morning. It has a role in our liturgy. We open our day, and we open particularly the part of our day when we sing God's praises with this poem that invokes us, that calls upon us, Zamiru, sing God's poetry, sing God's grace out loud. It's also, and that's at least from the time of the Geonim, at least from the late 900s. We know that it's been used as Shir Shel Yom in the days of Chanukah. It's used also when people bring bikurim. It's used, I want to make sure I don't forget anything because it's quite a list. It's used in people's private Chanukat Bait, when people dedicate a home, when they buy a home and dedicate it. And some people say it not only in Shir Shel Yom on Chanukah, but also when they actually light the candles. They light the candles, they say the normal brachot, they sing Ma'asur, and then they say this poem. And what I'd like to ask you is, let's choose one. It's too confusing. Let's choose one surprising one. Not Hanukkah that we just talked about, dedication of something new. We talked about that. Let's talk about Bikurim. People are bringing their first fruit. How is that related to this poem? Which of the many meanings we discussed does that draw upon, in your opinion? And I'll reopen the poem so we can all see it. Any thoughts? Anna, are you trying to say something?
Trepidatious.
I'm sorry?
Harvest is trepidatious. And then when you have harvest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that sense of being, if I understand correctly, Anne, you're saying that sense in the poem of despair, of feeling like we don't know, and then we do know, and it's a cause of joy. Anybody wants to add anything else? Any other aspects of the poem that make it fitting there? How does it mesh with Rabbi Sherlow's reading, for example, in your opinion?
You put the seeds in the ground hoping for success.
Like in Shir Ma'alot, right? Right, like we, in a different psalm that we sing before the meal on
Zorim
Shabbat.
Bedima Berina Yiktara, right?
Yeah, exactly. That like it's using a similar metaphor of crying that becomes Rina, but it specifically says that it's about sowing the field. I think it's also about newness. Rabbi Sherlow talks about how it's a song about setting up on a new path. So when you bring the first fruit, you're starting a new path in a sense. It's like you complete the path of the previous year. You have the fruits in your hands, and now starts the long and scary process of a new agricultural year. And you need to remind yourself, in a sense, that even in moments of despair during that year, to remember this moment of joy, this moment when you're holding the fruits in your hand, and that there's a possibility of having that again. Why do you think we say it on Hanukkah?
Hanukkah is the darkest time of the year. And
Physically,
so, physically the darkest time of the year. And a time when, well, every culture seems to want light and
Mhm.
look for, whether it be salvation or whatever. So it in that sense, it's a perfect psalm to read, just from that very obvious.
So you're saying that it's Hanukkah is a time that we celebrate salvation in a dark time, and this is a poem that reminds us that even in the darkest time, we should remember that God's anger lasts a moment, and then He gives us life. So
I mean, I'm saying both in terms of the physical, but also in terms of what we're celebrating. So that would be the second level of why we would say it on Hanukkah.
I see. Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. You're saying both the seasonal physical and the
Yes,
the concept of the holiday.
Yes.
Do you ladies agree? Do you have other suggestions, other ideas?
Oh, it has the word.
Yeah. Sorry, who is saying that? I can't see. Oh, Joyce. Yeah, it has the word Hanukkah. You're right. And if it's a song about Chanukkot, of whatever sense of what it means, that it's appropriate to read it on a day when we celebrate a dedication of the temple. In fact, there were many. There's a famous midrash called Midrash Psikta. I didn't bring it because it's extremely long, extremely long. But if you want to look for it, Psikta Rabbati is a collection of midrashim about the holidays or about particular Shabbatot and the year. It's an ancient midrash. And the whole midrash about Hanukkah is based on this poem. They're reading the entire actual story of the war against the Seleucid Syrian Greeks into this poem. Like they point out particular psukim in the poem and show how they relate to particular moments in the war, particular moments in the fight with the Maccabees. But I think that even if you don't do that, because for example, a different midrash reads the same poem as telling us the story of Purim, actually, and there's a text about that in the source sheet. We're not going to have time to read it now, but you're welcome to look later. So it doesn't have to be about Hanukkah, but the mere fact that it's talking about salvation and miraculous changes and the sense of starting something new all makes it a fitting poem. None of which can be said about the other psalm we're going to read today, and we're going to do it imminently, which is this one, Tehillim Tzadik Aleph, Psalm 91, that is very different, both in tenor and in theme. I mean, obviously it's still the poem talking about God because this is the Psalms, but it doesn't have that joyous celebration of something new. It doesn't have the sense of I was in darkness and then I was saved. It has a sense of I'm in darkness all the time and God is saving me all the time, but it's a very different tone. Let's read it together and see. O you who dwell in the shelter of the Most High and abide in the protection of Shaddai. I say of the Lord, my refuge and stronghold, Machzir Metsudati, my God in whom I trust, that He will save you from the fowler's trap, from the destructive plague. He will cover you with His pinions. You will find refuge under His wings. His fidelity is an encircling shield. You need not fear the terror by night, or the arrow that flies by day, the plague that stalks in the darkness, or the scourge that ravages at noon. Like I said, it's not just about nighttime. It's all the time. You're under attack all the time. 1,000 may fall at your left side, 10,000 at your right, but it shall not reach you. You will see it with your eyes. You will witness the punishment of the wicked, because you took the Lord, my refuge, the Most High, as your haven. No harm will befall you, no disease touch your tent, for He will order His angels to guard you wherever you go. They will carry you in their hands, lest you hurt your foot on a stone. You will tread on cobs and vipers. You will trample lions and asps. Because He is devoted to me, and here we hear God's voice. Because He is devoted to me, I will deliver Him. I will keep Him safe, for He knows my name. When He calls on me, I will answer Him. I will be with Him in distress. I will rescue Him and make Him honored. I will let him live to a ripe old age and show him my salvation. Quite the poem. Why do we read that in Hanukkah, in your opinion? What does it have to do with Hanukkah?
When do we read that on Hanukkah?
It's a minhag. It's not everybody
Every
does
day.
it, but it's a minhag to read it after candle. Sorry,
I
just a
have-
second. Can everybody just mute themselves except Joyce, because I hear a lot of feedback. And then if
No, I'm just saying that I've never experienced this particular minhag, so I wasn't aware that there was any connection between this this psalm and Hanukkah.
me neither. But as I was researching Psalms and Hanukkah, I came upon the fact that, in fact, a lot of the Hasidim and a lot of the Kabbalists recited on Hanukkah after lighting the candles. And my question is, why? What does that have to do with Hanukkah, in your opinion? Again, I don't think there's a right and wrong answer, so please feel free to share the wackiest theories. Yes, Nani?
I would not have necessarily chosen this, excuse me, except since you say that there is a connection, I would not have thought that there would be a connection. But looking at it, there's the word shield.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be like the shield of the Maccabees,
Mm-hmm.
and people falling to the left and to the right. In other words, the fighting in the Beit HaMikdash, and just the whole idea of destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it says disease, but maybe they're meaning disease more in the meaning of horrible calamity, as opposed to physical disease. So I mean,
Like
those are the, if I was trying to find a connection, those things kind of pop out a little bit.
So I think that's a good point, that it has these military undertones, like you sense the attacks are physical and malicious. And there's the sense that in Hanukkah, God protected us from malicious attacks and brought about a miraculous victory, not just a miraculous lighting of the menorah for 8 days, but a miraculous victory that preceded it. Does anybody see something else? Rebecca, you wanted to say something?
Well, I would just say that, just to follow up on that, I mean, I think we can understand people sort of grasping this and identifying with it because, you know, it was a sort of an exiled population that, whatever the Hanukkah story is, but, you know, built on it and the rabbis created this festival. And then you have millennial of oppressed Jews. So, and here you are, Hanukkah, you're lighting the candles and you're hoping for salvation and rededication and temple, et cetera, et cetera. So it's something that you can, I mean, we can all identify with as you're standing there lighting the candles, saying, you know, hoping for this feeling of salvation when you're wherever you are dispersed among the nations. So it seems we can understand why some people would say it and identify with this, the feelings of the author. Yeah.
So Rebecca, you're already paving the way to zooming out and looking at it not just as a poem that we have to literally find parts of that match, but look at the usage, look at the people who decided that this is going to be used at a certain point and trying to gain an insight into their needs and their emotions as we try and understand why the poem is used. And I think that's a very important step to take, because again, the Tehillim were never supposed to be just these like dead poems on a page. They're supposed to be a text that is performed and used, and that the performances and usages alter the way we see it. And not only is it used on Hanukkah, this particular poem was used already from ancient times, definitely from the Second Temple. We think also from the first, but the first times we specifically see it is from the Second Temple time. It was used in a very broad range of times. It's used, for example, I'll start with the contemporary usages and I'll work my way back into history. Today, it's used on Motzei Shabbat, as we leave behind the protection of Shabbat and walk into the world. It's used by people who are watching over a dead person. The shmirah, the people who are doing the shmirah, sitting with a dead person until the burial, say this psalm. After we leave a cemetery, after a burial, after azkara, we say this psalm. In Ari recommended to say this psalm in times of plague, very appropriate for today. Baal Shem Tov, interestingly enough, used to say this in Aseret Yemei Tshuva. It's an interesting question. Why? What about Aseret Yemei Tshuva is like all those times of dangers that we discussed? In Ezra and Nehemiah's time of this beginning of the resettlement in Israel, the Shivat Zion and the building of the Second Temple, they used it as they were building the walls of the new city. They said it and recited it over and over again. Later, the Gemara describes, and you have it in the source sheet later, you can look at it after the class, the Gemara describes that whenever they expanded Jerusalem, whenever they had to take what used to be wilderness, unused spaces, and turn it into a new neighborhood, a new marketplace, a new stable area for the horses of the pilgrims, whatever it is, they would start by walking. The chashuvim, the important people, would walk the perimeter of the new, rededicated, rearranged, renamed space, and they would recite Psalm 30 that we read before, and this psalm. And in the Gemara, they have a name for it that's then been used throughout history instead of Tehillim Tzadik Aleph, and that is Shir Shel Pgaim, a song of horrors or dangers or things that can afflict us. Afflictions, I guess, is a good way to describe it.
What was the Hebrew word you used again?
Pgaim, pega, pega,
Pagaim.
Pgaim, Pe Gimel Ain Yud Mem. I wrote it in English here in the title of the box here. So somehow this poem that seems to does have military undertones, but it's also has all kinds of references to all kinds of dangers that attack us all the time, became something that people recite in all these very, very different contexts. And before we kind of continue to the grand finale and try and fit it into Hanukkah more fully, do you see a common thread amongst all those different, or some of those different usages that people have?
It seems to me, it almost strikes me as a mezuzah, like a talisman.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, it's going to protect me here, it's going to protect me there, and it feels like a talisman to me.
Yeah, it's used, you're right, that it's used as a talisman. And in what times is it used? When do we need this talisman? What do the times have in common, in your opinion?
When you're embarking on something that is fraught with danger, or that
Yes.
has the potential to harm,
So
or that you're protecting from any future danger or potential to harm.
Mm-hmm. So why, for example, how does it fit then, for example, with Baal Shem Tov saying that in Aseret Yemei Tshuva, in your opinion? Or is that just different?
Maybe
Would you
beginnings.
translate that for me? I'm not sure I know what that was.
Sorry?
Would you translate that for me? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
the Baal Shem Tov,
Yes, I know that. When did he say it?
He used to say it in the 10 days of Tshuva between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
Of course, that makes complete sense.
Why, in your opinion?
Because you could die.
Yeah, it is. It's a somewhat, yeah, it's like, it's, you know.
It's
yeah.
obvious,
Mm-hmm.
in a way.
Nami, is that what you were going to say also?
I was going to say it's beginnings and endings. The
Mhm.
fact that you said that this is something that's said when somebody is sitting with a met, that it's something that somebody says when they're leaving a cemetery. And then you also said that it's something that the Chashuvim would say when they were kind of scouting out the new land that you said would be built. So it
Mhm.
sounds like it's beginnings and it's endings.
It also strikes me as though it's a poo.
Sorry?
It strikes me like it's a poo.
Yeah, it has that feeling. And it definitely is used like that.
Yeah.
Been used like that as a poo over history. Yes, Eileen.
I'd like to go back to your question about that some, I think it was Kabbalists and others now use it, say it when lighting candles on Hanukkah.
Mhm.
And I think the whole concept of Pirsum Hanes, and it's where you have the lights where everybody can see them, especially, for example, it's even more in Yerushalayim where it's outside the building in the little box and everybody can see it more clearly than if, sometimes at a window you can't see it as well if it's set back. And I have to remember all the things I thought of, but you're using it, it's like you're advertising, just like it's Pirsum Hanes for Chanukah. This is you're putting the light out in whatever the times are, whether it's a bad time or a relatively peaceful time. And so from the beginning and later on in the shelter of Hashem, you're trusting in that and advertising Pirsum Hanes. So it has to do with your emunah and how this is your shield.
Mm-hmm. You're saying that it's also, this poem is not just to soothe us, it's also us declaring that we have the faith that will protect us, in a sense. And by putting out the candles, we're calling upon it. We're showing that faith that comes from knowing that God will shield us, something like that.
And since since Pirsum Hanes is calling on that faith, then it's appropriate to use this psalm at that time. I think that might be how the concept got there.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point. And also something you said kind of led me to think of another aspect of it, which is there were a lot of times when it was very dangerous to light the Hanukkah candles. So on a physical level, there are times when we need protection, when we're unsafe, and showing that we're Jewish is an act of defiance. It's asking almost to be singled out in a sense for bad things. So we're calling upon God and asking him to protect us using this poem that's been used historically as a poo, as Naomi said, as Susan said. So, but I want to add another interpretation, and with that we have to finish, sadly. It's the end of our time. So I'll ask your indulgence to give me 5 more minutes and then I'll finalize. And that interpretation comes from the Midrashim that discuss the formation of this poem. Like before, we saw there's the question of whether David wrote this poem or was it named after him, or who is behind it. There's a very strong tradition in the Midrash that the author of this particular psalm is not David, it's Moshe Rabbeinu, and that he created it on 2 occasions, or created it and then reused it. Somehow it's related to 2 moments in his life. One moment, and again, you can see the sources in your source sheet later. One moment is the moment when he walked up Mount Sinai to receive the Torah and walked into God's clouds, when he somehow came in the presence of Shekhinah. And the second time is when the cloud covered the completed tabernacle and Moshe walked into it to speak with God. In other words, it's a poem that was created for moments not of physical danger per se, but of spiritual danger. For moments when Moshe comes so close to God, so close to God's presence and reality, that he's walking beyond the bounds of what normal human behavior is, what normal human experience is. Another thing that all those experiences where we read this poem have in common, it's not only beginnings and endings, it's not only times of dangers, it's also all about borders. It's about the borderlines. It's about building the literal borderline between the city and the wilderness. It's about the borderline between life and death. It's about the borderline between Shabbat and the time after Shabbat. And if we're talking about the Baal Shem Tov, reading it before Yom Kippur, it's the borderline between being forgiven by God and being doomed by God. And so in those moments of Moshe's life, he was crossing a border. And when we cross border, we expose ourselves. And this exposure can be dangerous, as Nadav and Avihu learned on their flesh when they brought fire in the wrong way into the tabernacle on the very day that apparently Moshe said this psalm. So perhaps going back to Rav Sherlow's interpretation, not of this one, but of Psalm 30, when he said that the idea of the dedication of the house and the idea of this poem is not this or that particular dedication, but it's rather all the dedications, all the beginnings of new processes. In light of that, let's go back for a second for the psychological experience of starting something new. When we start something new, as we said before, there's a certain enthusiasm, there's a certain energy that comes from the fact that we are beginning something that hasn't existed before. There's a certain sense of inspiration, of closeness to God, if you're a believer, or just feeling like part of the cosmos if you're not. There's a sense that we're bigger than life for a moment when we start on something new. And this is a dangerous moment, because this is a moment where we're crossing a boundary, where we can get lost, when our enthusiasm can lead us astray, where our enthusiasm can burn us by giving us wrong ideas, or by carrying us so far that later, when the time for hard work and daily minutia comes, we'll be burnt out. We're not going to have the energy for the long haul. So maybe part of why we're saying, those of us who are saying them, it's not everybody, but maybe part of the idea of those who say these two psalms and Hanukkah as we light the candles is exactly to remind us of these two dangers that we face when we start something new. The danger of being carried by our enthusiasm in a misguided way, by crossing the border into danger, by being so in love with our ideas that we don't notice how they don't match reality, or being so enthusiastic that we burn ourselves out and make ourselves sick or depressed or anything like that. And the danger of burning our energy so fast that later, in that moment when we feel like God is hidden because we have to do the long and tedious work of carrying out this path, we're not going to have the faith to carry us through. And we hold on to Psalm 30 to give us the strength also for the moments of despair ahead. And we hold on to Psalm 91 to give us protection from the dangers of the passage of the threshold, the moment of enthusiasm, the moment of borders being broken and something big and new rising out of it. And we walk with that into the holiday that's all about exploring newness and dedication and finding light in the great darkness. And this year, I never actually read these Psalms when I lit the candles, but I think this year I will try and reflect upon my own new beginnings, and I will try and rely on them for important reminders of the different ways new beginnings can endanger us. And with that, I want to wish you all Chanukah Sameach.
Thank you. Hanukkah Sameach.
It was wonderful to explore these psalms with you. And like I said, please, I'll ask Ilana again to send you my email. And if anybody has suggestions, questions, requests for topics about Tehillim, please let me know and I'll consider them. Okay?
Thank you, Rachel.